Here's a question that seems almost silly until you actually sit with it. Why did ancient humans guard fire like it was the single most precious thing they owned? Why did entire groups organize their days, their nights, their travel, even their sleep schedules around the simple task of keeping a flame alive? You'd think the answer is obvious. Fire is useful, so people kept it going. But that answer doesn't hold up under scrutiny, because keeping fire alive for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone knew how to reliably create it from scratch was one of the hardest, most demanding, most anxiety-inducing responsibilities early humans carried. And if you understand just how hard it was, and just how catastrophic it was to fail, you start to understand something deeper about why fire didn't just feed our ancestors. It shaped their societies, their rituals, even their sense of what it meant to be responsible for another life. It also forces you to rethink something people rarely question at all: the assumption that once humans had fire, that was basically the end of the story. In reality, having fire and keeping fire were two completely different problems, separated by an enormous technological gap, and that gap lasted for a genuinely staggering stretch of prehistory. Let's start with the thing most people get wrong. Early humans did not know how to make fire on demand. That skill, deliberately striking a spark or drilling friction into tinder, came dramatically later than the use of fire itself. For an enormous stretch of prehistory, likely spanning hundreds of thousands of years, humans were fire users long before they were fire makers. They captured flame from natural sources: a lightning strike, a smoldering tree after a wildfire, a volcanic vent, and then they kept it. Not for a day, not for a week, sometimes for years, passed from hearth to hearth, from generation to generation, never allowed to fully die out. If the flame went out and no wild source was nearby, the group could be without fire for months, and in some environments, that gap could be lethal. This single fact reframes everything. If you can't make fire, then fire isn't a tool you use and set aside. It's a dependent in the most literal sense. It has to be fed constantly, sheltered from wind and rain, watched through the night, and transported carefully whenever the group moved. Anthropologists studying firekeeping in more recent hunter-gatherer societies, groups like the Andaman Islanders, who historically had no reliable method of fire starting well into contact with the outside world, describe fire as something closer to a member of the household than a possession. It had to be tended. It had a designated keeper. Its loss was treated with the same gravity as losing a person, so think about what that means for daily life. Someone in the group, and this responsibility was often highly specific, sometimes gendered, sometimes assigned to particular individuals or families, had the job of making sure embers survived the night. That meant banking the fire correctly, burying coals in ash to slow their burn without extinguishing them, arranging windbreaks, choosing fuel that would smolder rather than flare and burn out too fast. It meant someone had to wake in the middle of the night, in the dark, in an environment full of predators, to check the coals and add fuel. Fail at this job, and the consequences weren't inconvenient, they were existential. And it wasn't only about the night. Travel posed an entirely separate challenge. When a group moved camp, which mobile hunter-gatherer bands did frequently, someone had to physically carry the fire with them. This usually meant transporting a slow-burning bundle, smoldering bark, dried fungus, or a tightly wrapped ember nest, protected from wind and rain for the entire journey, sometimes across days. Drop it, let it get soaked, let it snuff out in a river crossing, and the group arrived at their new camp with nothing. No cooking, no warmth, no protection, until they could either find a natural flame source or send someone to a neighboring group to beg for one. Consider what a group actually lost when a fire went out. Warmth, obviously, which in colder climates and colder nights was a matter of survival, not comfort. Protection from predators, since large carnivores generally avoid open flame, meaning a dead fire left a sleeping group exposed in a way that could easily prove fatal. The ability to cook food, which as we now understand from the biology of human digestion, wasn't optional for a species that had already evolved smaller jaws, shorter guts, and a brain that demanded enormous caloric input. And critically, the social center of the group, the place where people gathered, ate, talked, and coordinated the next day's plans, simply disappeared. A group without fire wasn't a group having a bad night. It was a group suddenly vulnerable on every front simultaneously. This is why archaeologists who study ancient hearths pay such close attention to something that sounds almost mundane: how long a hearth was used continuously. At sites like Kisum Cave in Israel, researchers found a hearth used repeatedly at the exact same spot for an extraordinarily long period, Layer after layer of ash accumulating over what appears to be hundreds of years of use by successive generations. That's not a fire someone lit once. That's a location treated as sacred infrastructure, maintained, returned to, and protected across lifetimes. The physical record of ash isn't just evidence of warmth, it's evidence of an unbroken chain of responsibility passed down through the group. And this is where things get genuinely strange to think about. If fire had to be protected this carefully, transported this deliberately, and mourned this seriously when lost, then firekeeping wasn't just a task. It was arguably one of the first forms of long-term collective responsibility in human history. Long before agriculture required communities to plan a full growing season ahead, long before permanent architecture required generational investment in a single location, firekeeping already demanded exactly that kind of thinking. Someone had to consider tomorrow, not just today. Someone had to think about the group's needs across a timeline longer than a single day's hunt. In a very real sense, before humans were farmers, before they were builders, they were already fire custodians, practicing the exact cognitive skill, delayed gratification tied to group survival, that almost every later human institution would eventually depend on. There's also a darker angle to this that's worth sitting with. Losing your fire in a landscape where a neighboring group had one wasn't just a resource problem. It was a vulnerability that could be exploited. Some anthropologists have speculated that fire scarcity may have driven some of the earliest documented instances of resource-based conflict or dependency between groups. A group without fire potentially needing to negotiate, trade, or in less generous interpretations of prehistoric social dynamics, beg or steal an ember from a neighboring band. Fire wasn't just kept alive out of practicality, it was kept alive because losing it could put your entire group at the mercy of others. This dynamic also meant fire carried real social weight. Being the group, or the individual, known for reliably keeping the fire alive wasn't a small thing. It was a form of status, a demonstrated trustworthiness that likely mattered in decisions about alliances, mates, and cooperation. Conversely, a group with a reputation for repeatedly losing their flame and depending on neighbors for embers may have been seen as less capable, less prepared, a weaker partner in the kind of mutual aid relationships early human survival depended on. By the time humans developed reliable fire-starting methods, hand drills, bow drills, strike-a-light techniques using flint and pyrite, something had already been deeply encoded into human behavior and possibly human psychology. The instinct to protect a flame, to treat it as something requiring vigilance and care rather than something disposable, persisted long after the technical necessity for that vigilance had eased. You can see faint echoes of it even now in how many cultures treat an untended campfire as something almost irresponsible to walk away from. In the near-universal discomfort people feel watching a flame get dangerously close to going out unattended. In the ritual significance fire still holds in ceremonies, religions, and Olympic torches carried across continents specifically, so the flame is never allowed to be extinguished along the way. So the next time you flick a lighter without a second thought, or walk away from a stove burner you just turned off, take 1 second to notice how effortless that is. For most of human history, that effortlessness didn't exist. Keeping a flame alive was a skill, a burden, and a sacred responsibility all at once, one that shaped how early humans organized their nights, their travel, their relationships, and their earliest sense of what it meant to be trusted with something the whole group depended on. The fire wasn't just warmth, it was the first thing humans learned they had to take care of, together, or lose everything.